What's splashin'? Welcome to season 9, episode 2 of Siren Sundays with your host, me, Lashanti the Siren. And today we have the wonderful guest, Dr. Craig Dahlgren, who is the executive director of the Perry Institute for Marine Science. Welcome to the show, Craig.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a while that I've wanted to be on, so I'm finally getting my chance.
I know, 3 years, and I've finally been able to get you on. I'm so excited just to talk about your journey into marine conservation. And while I know you are, in my opinion, labeled the expert of corals in the Bahamas, you also have a lot of experience and knowledge about the mangroves and the other ecosystems that exist around us. And I think I went as far as to say on my Instagram live earlier that I think you are just like the most informed opinion on most, if not all, things in the marine environment for the Bahamas at this point. And so I give you that title. I'm sure many others might agree.
Thank you for that.
I'm just thrilled to have you share your story. So we can jump right in, and you could talk a bit about your initial backgrounds, like when you first decided what you wanted to be and how you ended up being Dr. Craig Dahlgren.
Yeah, so I grew up in like suburbia in New York City suburbs, and I always wanted to be a marine biologist from the time I was a kid. I think part of that, the biology part, was because my father was a high school biology teacher and he exposed me to a lot of that stuff at a young age. But then we had friends and family that had places along the coast, and we'd go out on boats or to the beach or whatever. And it was just fun exploring. And I decided from, I guess, kindergarten or maybe earlier that I wanted to be a marine biologist. My career path kind of took different twists and turns, and it didn't quite look like that was going to happen until grad school. But I guess as I got older, I didn't think you could actually make a career of being a marine biologist. And I thought you had to be like I didn't want to be a doctor. I thought maybe I could be a lawyer, maybe go into business doing something. But so that's what I did when I went to college. But then a friend of mine, I actually applied to law schools and got in, and a friend of mine said, "Why do you want to do that?" And I couldn't come up with an answer. So kind of went back to the drawing board and ended up going into marine biology through a back door, I guess.
But you did do a master's, or did you go straight into a PhD program?
So as an undergraduate, I took enough biology classes it wasn't a minor or anything, but it was enough to just like make it so I knew something about biology. And then I took a year and did this program that's called the 3Cs program now, where we did a semester focused on marine biology, a non-degree program, but focused on marine biology in Friday Harbor, Washington, in the Pacific Northwest, in Jamaica at Discovery Bay, and then outside of Boston in the Northeast at Northeastern University. And that kind of got me to say, yeah, I really do like this. Maybe I could make a career of it. So I went and got a master's after that. And then after my master's, got a PhD.
So at what point in your career did you first start coming to the Bahamas?
Yeah, so after I did that program where we did stuff in Pacific and Caribbean and Atlantic, I got an internship, actually. This was back in over 30 years ago, internship at the Shark Lab in Bimini. And it was right when the Shark Lab, I think it was the first full year it was open or something. So I did an internship there, and then just had the opportunity to keep coming back to the Bahamas on different research cruises, things like that. I didn't do my master's research in the Bahamas. It was in North Carolina on some reefs offshore there. But there was enough research going on in the Bahamas that I could stay involved. And then when it came time to do my PhD research, it was all focused on Nassau grouper in the Bahamas.
Nice. And so, as I was saying earlier, I see you now, and I think most of the country who's aware sees you as the coral expert. But as you said, you have experience with fisheries, the Nassau grouper and the Caribbean spiny lobster, and also the emerging fisheries. Like, you were involved with things related to sea cucumbers, sponges, and I was especially interested about the sponges in my short stint at the Institute. And I just wanted to know what about coral, or did you just happen to fall into coral just being the area that you seem to focus on most?
Right. So I think I'm very much a generalist. I do a lot of stuff, and my background is more with fish ecology. So I still do some of that there. Uh, the fish I was studying, Nassau grouper as juveniles in creeks where there's mangrove. So I started doing some mangrove research as an offshoot of that. Um, and then did a lot of stuff with adult Nassau grouper on the reef, and just kind of came to realize that even though there's a lot of issues with fisheries or with mangroves or other things, it doesn't really compare to the issues, the threats, the potential damage that coral reefs face. So I've been doing a lot of work on coral for um, probably the past 15 years or so. I definitely don't look at myself as a coral expert, but more of a coral reef ecologist that knows a lot about a bunch of different things versus somebody who's very specialized in corals.
No, but I think that's so important, and especially given a lot of the challenges that we are seeing with coral recently, it's important to have someone like you who has been around this long and can tell us, like what has coral looked like 30 years ago compared to what it looks like now.
Yeah, yeah. And I I've definitely seen changes in the time that I've been working in the Bahamas on reefs. And by no means were the reefs in pristine, perfect shape when I came into the picture. So um, I definitely think they were in a lot better shape then, but they'd already seen some severe damage from diseases and coral bleaching events and things like that. Um, but I have definitely seen a lot of changes, a lot of changes due to storms or water temperature increasing, causing bleaching or disease, um, some of which there's been pretty decent recovery from, and others where it's, yeah, this is kind of lost and we may never see it again unless we really extreme steps to bring them back.
Right. I know I don't want to not, I don't even say bore the audience, but I know a lot of times we in the sector have talked about the fact that a lot of people in the public think that coral and coral reefs are just rocks that are in the ocean. So can you just give like just a short, if you had to do like maybe a quick intro to corals about what coral are, and then just like why coral reefs are so important for the marine environment as a whole?
Yeah. So the the coral, it's an animal, not a rock. Uh, it's an animal like a sea anemone. It's pretty simple. It's a mouth with tentacles, basically, attached on a stalk of some kind to the bottom. Is different than a sea anemone, though, and a little bit more complicated in that one, it creates a limestone, a calcium carbonate skeleton around it that it lives in. Um, and when it grows, it won't just get bigger and bigger and bigger indefinitely. When it grows to a certain point, it'll divide and form a clone of itself that lives right next to it. And that happens over and over and over again. And as it does that, it keeps building up that limestone skeleton, and that's what forms the coral, the what looks like a rock down there. Um, the other thing that makes coral very complicated is that it it is an animal. It does feed like an animal. It uses those tentacles to catch stuff that swims by, bring it into its mouth. It feeds itself like that.
Mhm.
But most of the energy on the reef building corals comes from microscopic plants, single cell plants called zooxanthellae that live inside the coral tissue itself. Um, and that's what gives the corals their colors that you see underwater. So it's an animal, but it's a lot more complicated. That's an animal that creates a rock that relies on plants. And then it doesn't have an immune system like people do or anything. Um, it has an association with microbes, bacteria, things like that, that can protect it to an extent. But when those get out of balance, that's when diseases come in and can really wreak havoc on those corals and kill them. So um, they're actually a very complicated animal in spite of just having tentacles in the mouth, and that's it.
Yeah. No, I think, and that's so fascinating. And to the point of no immune system, that brings me to the question about, stony coral tissue loss disease. And I remember earlier on, and I'm not sure if there is a definitive answer now, but there was this question of whether or not this disease was a virus or if it was bacterial. Like, have we kind of figured out what it is?
Yeah. So we're still learning about stony coral tissue loss disease, and we being the scientific community in general, there's a huge effort throughout the Caribbean, especially in Florida at some of the universities and government agencies there to figure this out and see what the cure is for stony coral tissue loss disease. The best we know, we still haven't identified what the actual pathogen is that causes it, but it does appear that there's a viral infection of those single cell plants, the zooxanthellae that live in the coral tissue, that may start a chain reaction that includes changes to the microbiome, the microbes that are normally associated with the coral, so that the ones that are helpful to the corals become off balance with the ones that are harmful, and the bacteria can then go on and kill the coral itself too. We're still learning what those are and what to do about it too. We know that we can treat this disease on an individual coral colony with antibiotics in a paste that we can apply, a slow release paste. But there's no real broad scale vaccination or cure or anything for it. But we are doing, and we PIMS with some of our partners are starting to do some of that research to look and see, is there a probiotic that can eliminate the harmful microbes and promote growth of the healthy ones. And we're doing that. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that in the Bahamas right now, so we're doing that in Colombia. That project's getting started in the next month or so.
That's exciting. And so, and just to explain how dire this is to some of our viewers, when a coral has been impacted by this disease and you do treat it, what is the sort of recovery of that coral that is now, maybe half of it is completely already, gone because of this disease?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, corals aren't like normal animals, right? It's not like a dog or a cat that either it heals or it doesn't heal.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of more like a tree where part of it can die, a branch can die, but the rest of it can live. And that's what we see with corals. When we don't treat corals that do get infected with this disease, it's almost a guaranteed death sentence. There's just such a high mortality rate. If we can intervene and treat the coral with this antibiotic, the area that the disease kind of progresses across the coral. So you'll see it kind of progress as a line that expands outwards, and anything on one side will be dead. Anything on the other side of that line where we treat it will survive. Over time, over years, the healthy coral can overgrow what died and form, or something else. It's at that point, it's just bare rock. And at that point, something else, seaweeds can colonize that and start growing, or sponges or other things that could inhibit recovery of that coral. So in the ideal world, that coral can heal over the dead part. But what we are more likely to see is that that kind of real estate on the reef gets taken up by something new like seaweeds.
Yeah, and I know stony coral tissue loss disease, such a mouthful, it only affects certain coral species, correct?
Yeah. Again, we're still learning more and more about this, but it affects about half of the reef building coral species that we have in the Bahamas. The other half, for whatever reason, we still don't know exactly why, are not affected by it at all. Mm-hmm. Which there's all kinds of diseases out there that affect corals. There's probably a dozen or more somewhere between a dozen and 2 dozen diseases out there.
Right.
Most will affect, you know, 1 or 2 species. This one affects um, over 20, 25, 26 species or so. So it's a little bit unique in that way, but it doesn't affect everything.
And have you ever, throughout your career, seen a disease impact coral this drastically?
No, not this drastically. When corals are when their environment uh, becomes difficult for them to live in, uh, it can cause stress on the corals, physiological stress on the corals, um, and they become more vulnerable to disease. And we have seen disease outbreaks that happen when those events happen. But this one, there's nothing quite like it. The
Wow.
way it spreads so rapidly, the number of corals that it infects, and how quickly it can kill corals is beyond what we've seen before. I mean, we're seeing corals that probably took 300, 400 years to grow that can be killed in a matter of weeks from the disease. So it's definitely an extremely serious situation and one of the biggest threats to coral reefs in the Bahamas right now, but not the only threat.
I was just going to get to that, because even through the midst of this, underwater pandemic of such, we have what's currently happening is this mass coral bleaching event right now in the Bahamas. And if you can just share with our viewers, what is a mass coral bleaching event,
Right.
and how are these two either compounding the threats to coral right now?
Sure. So corals live in stable, warm tropical waters, like in the Bahamas and Caribbean. Um, they have a real specific range of temperatures that they can live in. And when the waters get too warm or too cold, um, what happens is the symbiosis, the relationship between the coral host and the microscopic plant that lives inside of it breaks down, and the coral's response to spit that out. And when that happens, that little plant is what's giving the coral its color. So when the coral spit out all of those hundreds of thousands or whatever out of its tissue, um, you can see the coral tissue is usually perfectly clear. You can see right through it to that white limestone skeleton underneath. And that's why we call it bleaching, because it looks like it's been bleached. So anyway, what's happening right now is that this summer we've seen water temperatures much hotter than normal. Normally water temperatures in Celsius, max out in the Bahamas around 30 degrees Celsius. They're about 2 degrees above that. And while that might not seem a lot, it's just enough to throw things out of balance for that coral and the algae that live inside of it. And what we're seeing is throughout all of the Bahamas, we're seeing some degree of bleaching. In some places, around Nassau, the reefs there, in the Exuma Keys, we've been there, and on some reefs, up to 100% of the corals are bleached. There's a few species that are less affected, but there's none that are really escaping this bleaching event. And it's a concern because the coral is relying on that microscopic plant for food.
Right.
And without it, if it goes on long enough, that coral could starve and die, basically.
Right.
So we have seen this in the Bahamas before. Going back to the 80s, it's been documented. So it happens from time to time, usually during an El Nino year. What's really, and in 1998, there was a severe event in the Bahamas that ended up leading to the death of about half of the corals in monitoring stations on Andros.
Wow.
And it was part due to the bleaching killing the corals, and part, like I mentioned before, that kind of physiological stress that they go through makes them more vulnerable to diseases. And there was a diseases that came in afterwards and wiped out a bunch. What we're seeing now is worse than 1998. Temperatures have been reach that past that threshold where corals bleach back in July in many places.
Wow.
Usually that doesn't occur till around this time of year, till September.
Right.
September to early October, the peak of the warm season. Um, so the corals have been subject to this high temperature for much longer than they ever have before. And we are seeing large scale bleaching. We are seeing corals starting to die. And there's really little that we can do about it at this point. Um, we can't cool the waters. We can't
This
shake
is going to
them.
be my question. Can we just
Yeah.
drop a big chunk of ice in the water, you know?
Yeah, no, it's not
No?
like we can bring an iceberg down from up north and cool things down or pump water up from real deep. You could do it for,
Idea.
you know, uh, a little area, but not for the, what, 21,000 square miles of reef that are, or 2,100 square miles of reef that are in the Bahamas. So, um, yeah, we can't do much, but what we can do is try to reduce other things that are have compounding effects on corals, other threats and stresses. And then after this is over with, we can look and see how we can restore them, and can we restore them with more resilient corals that are less likely to bleach in the future or less likely to get a disease in the future. There's things that we can do like that. Um, it's just it takes a lot of work and time and effort and money and people and everything else to do that.
Yeah, and it's so sad because, like you said, we are already dealing with stony coral tissue loss disease, and now to have most of our corals stressed out from this coral bleaching, it's really a dire state. And we actually do have a question from the audience that I think is really important to answer right now. D'Angelo asks, why should the Bahamian public be concerned about coral reef? I think a lot of times Bahamians hear, you know, marine biologists, marine ecologists, and people who are working in conservation talk about the importance of reefs and think that it's only important for fishermen. You know, it's only important for people who have tourists. But can you explain, you know, why should the public as a whole be concerned about coral reefs?
Yeah, yeah. Um, so coral reefs are the most valuable ecosystem in the Bahamas, most valuable ecosystem in the world, actually, on a per unit area basis. And that value comes from a bunch of different things. They're the first line of defense against coastal erosion, flooding, things like that. So um, without those coral reefs, there would be a lot more and bigger waves breaking along the shoreline that would cause erosion, destroy beaches, destroy property and houses, things like that.
Because the rock is
And
limestone. I mean, I think we always
right,
forget that, right? Like that breaks up very quickly.
exactly, exactly. And without them during storms, you know, people's lives would be more at risk.
Yeah.
They're also very important in supporting fisheries. So most of the seafood that you're eating is coming from a coral reef. Or even if it's not coming from a coral reef, like conch, they don't necessarily live on the reefs that much. They're living in the sand and seagrass and whatever around them. Without the reefs, there wouldn't be that, though. So almost all of the seafood is dependent on the coral reef. And then the other thing is for tourism, it's important too. The dive and snorkeling industry in the Bahamas is huge, and
Right.
even if you're not involved in that, that's what's bringing in a lot of money from foreign tourists. That's pumping it into the Bahamian economy in general. So there's indirect benefits that trickle down from that.
I know I've always said this, and while I also, and I don't even like to even claim my degree anymore because I feel like I've been so far removed for so long. I always kind of tell people, just as a quick comparison, you know, like we look at Florida beaches, no offense to Florida, and then, you know, Florida is not very far from the Bahamas, and I think coral reefs are one of the reasons why our waters are so crystal clear and so clean, because they play such an important role in that. And tell me if that's not a myth that I've just had, or is that actual fact? Like this is why our water is
No,
crystal clear.
the white sand beaches of the Bahamas are from corals. It's from the corals breaking down from parrotfish and other organisms also breaking down the corals. It's there, and you know, coral reefs are constantly going through being eroded or destroyed and being created and built up. Um, and in the past, it's always kind of favored the building up. They've been expanding, growing, uh, as these bleaching events kill them, as diseases kill the corals, as other threats reduce resilience of those reefs. The breaking down part is starting to win a lot more. And if the coral growth can't keep up with what's being broken down, we will see some big changes like that. But yeah, to get back to your point, yeah, Bahamian beaches are what they are because of the reef.
That's good to know. And I know, just to go back to when you were talking about finding and getting more resilient corals, I know the Perry Institute does have the Reef Rescue Network, which has played a huge role in coral restoration work. And I would love the opportunity for you to share a bit about how successful that program is in really not creating, but having these nurseries with some of them being, if I'm not mistaken, heat, more heat tolerant corals, correct?
Yeah. So um, we are growing thousands of corals in nurseries around the Bahamas, in water nurseries. So we basically, the way this kind of coral restoration works is you take a cutting off of a live coral, healthy coral, um, grow it in an in-water nursery that provides it with an environment that's safe from predators, from disease, things like that, and puts it in a place where it's going to have a higher growth rate than it would growing on the seafloor as well. And then as those corals grow, we can take cuttings from the ones we're growing in the nursery and put those back on the reef. So that's what the Reef Rescue Network is about. We have partners throughout um, most of the family islands, from Long Island on up to Abaco, where we're working with dive operators and resorts and tour operators and nonprofit organizations to all work together to uh, form this network of nurseries to help build things up. And we've been doing this for a number of years. We've scaled it up a lot recently, but we've been doing coral restoration in the Bahamas for about 15 years now. And we know it can be effective. Um, the species that we're working with mostly on that are two of the faster growing species, elkhorn coral and staghorn coral, which are both critically endangered, actually. So the other benefit is helping to bring back a critically endangered species like you would with a captive breeding program for a panda or something like that. um, but what we can do then is look and do the science, look and see which ones are more resilient to disease or will survive a greater range of temperatures, or identify what temperature range they do in and try to repopulate reefs that are normally in that temperature range with corals that do well. We're able to do this to a large extent. And we've had some results already, seeing how the corals that are from the Bimini area, for example, see chronic heat stress. They see it more frequently than ones from Cat Island, say.
Why? Why is that?
Um, Two reasons. The ones from Cat Island, they're more exposed to the open Atlantic Ocean,
Mm.
which is a more stable, cooler in the summer, maybe warmer in the winter temperature, versus the ones over by Bimini that, one, get a lot of heat coming through on the Gulf Stream and from the south, and two, uh, the Bahama Banks heat up in the summer and cool down in the winter. And it's like they live in a bathtub for half the year, in a hot bath. And they just are, because they've been used to survive in those conditions, they're better equipped to deal with it. And as we see these bleaching events happen, they're the ones that really survive. So, that's one thing to look for. Now, we also need to look and see how disease and other factors affect those corals too. We don't want to just uh, breed corals or grow corals that are resilient to one thing only to have something else come in and wipe them out. So there's still a lot of research that needs to be done, but we're at the point where we can do these things now.
That's so exciting. And I wonder, what is the better term almost to compare this to? Like, is it good to say like it's coral gardening or coral farming? Like, what would you, because it is like you would compare coral to a tree earlier, and it is almost like, you take a clipping like you do with some tree
Yeah.
species and it can continue to grow. Like, what would you say, it's more like gardening or farming of coral?
I think in that ways it's probably a little more like gardening, but I guess at the scale that we need to do it, it's more like a farming approach. And really, that's just one of the approaches we do have to restoring reefs. I mean, we're also in the past have done a lot of work where we have collected gametes from corals when they spawn, and we can fertilize the eggs, grow the larvae, and release the larvae back onto the reef, or grow them to the point where they settle out and form little corals. And once they get to be, say the size of a quarter or something, we can put them back out on a reef, and they'll have a better chance of surviving than if we just put them out as larvae. So with that, then we can do some selective breeding too, to make sure that we're increasing genetic diversity in some areas, or focusing on some genetics that we would like to increase in the population.
That almost sounds a bit like farming.
Yeah.
Like the artificial insemination type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do think it's such a cool thing to talk about, coral spawning. And people who I've spoken to in the past, they're actually really surprised to know that it's like clockwork. Like, they have a certain time of year, and it's usually, I think, somewhere around the full moon. Can you talk to us a little bit about like the regularity of coral spawning, and how you're actually able to rely on that predictability?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, you got to think about a coral, right? It's a little sea anemone type of creature. It doesn't have a brain, doesn't have eyes, doesn't know, what's going on. It can't see that it has other corals near it or whatever. So over time, it's just evolved where they all spawn at the same time for each species. So for some species, for example, we'll know that a certain number of days after the full moon in September, at such and such a time, is when they will spawn. And sure enough, we can go out there like clockwork. And that was probably going to be, maybe over one night, 2 nights, 3 nights they spawn, but it's that synchronous that they do it. Other species frustrate us a little bit, and they're a little less predictable. And maybe it's August, maybe it's September. We're not quite sure. Or on this reef, it's August, and the next reef, it's September. But it is only over a few days on a few specific nights a year. For some reason, most of them, it's late at night in times when you wouldn't be out there diving ordinarily, past my bedtime. So
They like their privacy,
I guess so. I guess I can't blame them. But yeah, it is just something they've evolved, that it's very predictable for a lot of species, and it only happens a couple nights a year for those species.
That's awesome. And I have had the privilege a few years ago, to actually see, it was one of the, I think, boulder coral species.
Mm-hmm.
Not too late at night, fortunately, but it was like right at dusk. And if, I don't know, I don't know if that's public information, if people would just want to go and observe that. It's not as exciting as maybe, people in our field will find it for others, but I think it's one of those things where, you just see nature take its course. And like you said, these animals, they have been around for so many years, so many decades and centuries without eyes and ears, and they just kind of know that this is my one chance to do this, and they do it all the time. And I love that Lynn is actually, thank you so much for viewing, she has a wonderful question that I had actually thought about asking, but I wasn't sure. So can Dr. Dahlgren provide an overview of the partnership with Atlantis?
Yeah. And that fits in well with this conversation about stony coral tissue loss disease and coral spawning. We've been partnering with Atlantis and the Atlantis Blue Project Foundation for as long as it's been in existence, really, on various things. And right now, the partnership really is focused on stony coral tissue loss disease. And We have received funding from Atlantis and from the Disney Conservation Fund to establish a coral rescue program, living gene bank, really, at Atlantis. And we are partnering with the government and University of Bahamas on this as well. And what we're going to be doing is taking in corals that are under threat from stony coral tissue loss disease, taking whole coral colonies or parts of coral colonies from the wild and bringing them into a biosecure area in Atlantis where we can then grow them. And the importance of this is that we're going to be doing it for a number of species that are threatened with extinction by stony coral tissue loss disease. So we'll be preserving those, the genetics of those corals for the future. And what we have also done there is we're not just going to hold these indefinitely like they're in a museum or something. We're going to actually propagate them. And we have gotten a very high-tech coral spawning system that basically tricks corals into, they have that internal clock that tells them when to spawn. We can trick them into spawning at other times. So instead of
them into spawning at different times.
Well, it's manipulating their environment, right? So that instead of,
I'm in the mood. Yeah.
Exactly. During my coffee break on Monday, October 2nd, in the morning, I can get them to think that it's midnight on September 15th when they ordinarily would be spawning. And we can do that time and time again to get them to spawn. Don't have to go out in a boat in the middle of the night. We can just do it right there, fertilize the eggs in the lab, get those corals growing, and pump out, hopefully, hundreds of thousands of offspring to help repopulate reefs. And this is, it's new for the Bahamas. It's modeled after a system that is being done in Florida right now. There's a particular species of Florida, coral in Florida, rather, that's called pillar coral. And we have it in the Bahamas too. Dendrogyra ciliaris is the scientific name. It's extinct in the wild in the Florida Keys. It used to be fairly common. There's only about 20 colonies left that are all being grown in captivity, I think, at the Florida Aquarium. And really the only hope for restoring these in the wild in Florida is through captive breeding, again, like you would do with a panda or a tiger or something like that. These corals are just as threatened, if not more threatened with extinction. So having these tools that we can use to bring them into a safe environment, grow them there, propagate them there, and then reestablish populations out in the wild is it's going to be a game changer in terms of dealing with these events like stony coral tissue loss disease or bleaching.
That is so exciting. Oh my gosh. And, and I feel like I did the Perry Institute for Marine Science such a disservice in not having, even at the beginning of the episode, this brief history of you guys, because one of the things that I always used to get whenever I brought you, PIMS up is, well, what's that? What are they? How are they new? And I'm like, no, like these guys have been around for years. And I always used to, in an endearing way, call you guys like the secret scientists. Like you're the ones that are behind the scenes doing a lot of this work that people, like the unsung heroes, I feel like, of the scientific community. So I would love for you to, just take us back a bit and talk about, because I think the Perry Institute has been over 50 years working in the Bahamas, in the marine environment, in research. And I would love for you to just take a moment and talk about that.
Yeah. No, thanks for giving us the opportunity to do that. The Perry Institute for Marine Science was established in 1970, 1971, 70 in the US, 71 in the Bahamas, as a nonprofit research institute by a guy named Mr. Perry, John Perry. He happened to own a key in the Exumas, Lee Stocking Island. And from the 70s through about 2012 or so, he established a lab and field station for marine scientists on Lee Stocking Island. And there was all kinds of studies done on aquaculture, on deep sea systems, on coral reefs, on fisheries, things like that. Really groundbreaking for its time. And for a while, it was funded by the US federal government as one of 6 at the time of NOAA's undersea research centers. It attracted scientists from around the world and was one of the most productive marine labs in terms of generating research. Mr. Perry died. Congress decided they didn't want to fund that program anymore. And we went dormant for a few years. And then in 2016, whether it was foolish or wise, I don't know. I revived the Institute with a little bit different mission, where we're no longer looking to simply provide a research station and tools for international scientific community to come in and do work, but we're actually doing that research ourselves in partnership with the international scientific community, and really integrating it into the local conservation and fisheries management, natural resource management. So we are partnering with government, with University of Bahamas, with different nonprofits around the country, with schools to provide education, really making it so that we're addressing needs of the Bahamas, and with Bahamians now leading the way, staffing the Institute, and doing the research and conservation work. So it's definitely something that we're growing. Yeah, we're no longer just a science organization. We're definitely involved in conservation and capacity building in the Bahamas.
Definitely. I can definitely say you guys are like that quintessential global organization. You're global, but you're also local. And I definitely benefited so much from my time working directly at the Perry Institute for Marine Science, but also at my time in the Bahamas National Trust. I mean, I probably would have never learned how to be a technical diver, and I'm still not that great at it. But if it weren't for you and it wasn't for the Perry Institute training in AGRA, which is the acronym just slipped me as soon as I said it. The definition.
Atlantic and Gulf Rapid Reef Assessment.
Awesome. Yes. And I think you guys have assisted with the training of so many Bahamians in being able to collect this data that is so crucial for us to understand our marine environment and what we have, and what we need to do to keep what we have as well. So.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something that we're focusing on more and more. And even just training Bahamians to be divers. We just finished up a course with government representatives from Department of Marine Resources, Department of Environmental Planning and Protection to get certified to dive. And in another week or so, we're starting an instructor development course training Bahamians to be scuba instructors. One, because it'll help economically provide jobs and stuff for Bahamians, but also I think some of the love that I feel for coral reefs and the oceans come from my experiences in it, and we need to make that experience accessible to more people. So hopefully by training Bahamians to be instructors, it'll more Bahamians actually get to dive and see what's in their country.
Definitely. And I think you guys are doing a great job. And I know one of my favorite programs is that Rising Tide program that gives those high school students, which I often find, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, or an audience viewer can correct me, you guys really pick the right niche that I think is a bit underserved in the Bahamas. You know, we have people who are going out and talking to kids who are in elementary school, and having these fun summer camps, and the age usually cuts off at around 13 and 14. But the Rising Tide program really appeals to senior high school students, and some of those kids have never even snorkeled, and they get this experience to really decide, like, wow, I can see a career in the marine science sphere, and I can meet people, I can meet Bahamians, who actually work in this field, and they fall in love with it. And I know that you've had a few students already go off to school to study marine biology after having been in this program. So how exciting. I think you guys are really such unsung heroes, and I always get so excited when I get to speak with one of you guys from the show. You're my fourth Perry Institute staff to come on the show, and you really should have been the first, but it's okay because everything happens at the right time.
Well, thanks for having me now.
Yeah, and I know as we are starting to wind down the episode, I do have a few more questions for you. And before we switch completely off of coral in the Bahamas, I do maybe want to share your personal opinion, professional opinion. Do you think that there's hope for coral in the Bahamas, for the coral reefs?
Yeah, I wouldn't be doing this if there wasn't hope. That would just be a waste of my time and other people's money. So there is hope. The situation is dire. Um, things are really. I mean, I don't want to be over dramatic about it, but they really are hanging in the balance right now. We are faced with challenges that we've never seen before, and I think we have the tools and technology. I think we have the innovation and creativity to address these issues. Um, it's just a matter of putting it all together and being able to do it uh, at the scale that we need it to happen at. It's a huge challenge, but I do have hope.
So, what would you say to our viewers or to anyone who is watching, especially the Bahamians? Like, how can they help? Whether it be financial donations or getting out there, spreading the word. Like, what can people do to really help?
There's a lot. There's all different ways to get involved based on people's interests and abilities. Obviously, if somebody's a scuba diver and really enthusiastic, they can go out with us and help restore coral reefs. If somebody is not certified to dive or whatever, there's work we're doing in the mangroves that they can help with. But really, the biggest things are just little day-to-day choices. What you eat, for example, is very important. And just being a little aware of what species are threatened or endangered or what are ecologically important for the health of the reefs, and not having those maybe as much as you would otherwise would be a good start. The other thing is that a lot of these reefs are dying from climate change, and we all have our own small part to do there. I know it's tough to make a difference as an individual, um, but we need to start somewhere. So there are things like that people can do. But if you do want to get involved in terms of actively helping out, we on our website have a tab called Get Involved, and there's definitely things that we can do, whether it's internships or student opportunities or community engagement that we can do to help.
And I did, of course, I had a look at your website, and I did put the URL up really quickly on that donate tab. And there are more than just financial donations. You guys do have a section called in-kind donations, which is not necessarily someone having to give money, but just to put into perspective for people watching, $50 it can pay for one tree, and that's about 50 corals. So if you want to get together as a group, if you want to get together as an individual and get a couple of friends and just donate, that'd be so helpful. And even just like Craig said, there are so many in-kind donations that you can do. Maybe you can borrow a boat, like let them borrow your boat. But I do, to your point of internships and volunteering, the best place for people to get that information would definitely be your social media. And I know you guys have a newsletter that people can subscribe to as well.
Yep.
Just to stay tapped in. And I think back to my point of you guys being such unsung heroes, one, we're excited. We have hope because of you. Groundbreaking has been your business since your inception of the Perry Institute, and then your reinvigoration of it. But I think just as far as opportunities that you've given Bahamians and are able to give Bahamians is so amazing. I know so many people in the marine conservation sector right now. I think in some way, shape, or form, they've actually either interned there or been trained by you guys. And so I look forward to getting you guys out there more and seeing people get more involved and you guys getting more internships and opportunities. But enough about PIMS. The last two questions for Craig. You yourself as a person.
Okay.
First of two, who is somebody in the sector that inspires you and why? And this can be someone local in the Bahamas or just international from anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I would say looking internationally, there are marine biologists that were doing stuff around when I was a kid and are still active. And seeing them and how they are still able to do this, and the difference that they've made in terms of scientific discovery and in terms of helping to save uh, coral reefs. People like Judy Lang, who was the one that came up with agra that we were talking about earlier, or even a guy like Carlton Ray, who was critical in establishing the Bahamas National Trust in the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park. Um, he's still writing books. So that inspires me. And then also, I would say I am inspired by kind of the younger generation from me coming up in marine science, particularly the number of Bahamians that are getting their PhDs and actually doing work in the Bahamas is inspiring as well. And that's just something that at the start of my career, really wasn't an option for many people, and now it is.
That's awesome. So my last question, after you're so many decades in the marine space, and you shared 1992 to me earlier, and I was like, oh my God, Craig, that's like, I was like 1 when that happened. So it's so interesting that you've had probably so many experiences, and we definitely didn't get time in to hear any of your fun, maybe like research trip stories, but throughout your time, if you can share a final thought or thoughts, if you have them, that may have come from like lessons learned over your time, like what would you share with a viewer, whether it be a person just interested or just somebody who wants to be the next Craig Dahlgren,
Um,
shoes, big shoes, but what would you say to somebody who
for anyone who's looking to get into this field, I definitely didn't go the typical route that most people go in marine science or in conservation for that matter. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's given me different perspectives than a lot of people have. And it's allowed me to shape Perry Institute and my career to be not just an academic that's studying something very specific, but really trying to get involved in a lot of things and make some big changes. So I would just encourage people to, no matter where your starting point is, if this is something you're passionate about, there's ways to get involved. And even if it's not through science, through storytelling or photography or whatever your passion is, it can make a huge difference. And there's plenty of room and opportunities for you to get involved.
I love that. It's very inspirational, and definitely just you as a person is so inspirational, and I always enjoy whenever, as I used to tell you, anytime I found out that I was going on a field expedition and I saw that Dr. Craig Dahlgren was there, I was so excited to be on these trips with you and to just soak up the knowledge that you have, and I look forward to continuing to see the Perry Institute for Marine Science grow and to see you mentor so many young Bahamians and other young people. You influence a lot others that are not just Bahamian, and so that's so exciting. And I can't thank you enough for taking time out on your Sunday afternoon to chat with me. And I'm very thrilled. I feel like I need to have you come back on again. Stories from the field.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm equally thrilled to be able to reach an audience like this. So thanks a lot, Lashanti.
That's not a problem. And thank you guys so much for riding another wave with us on Siren Sundays. And I look forward to seeing you all next week.